Hello, young people. Here we go. You could start this by just copying this. I'm not going to write in here as we go, and I'm also not going to, require you to watch this whole video. I want you to get this into your Lineless notebooks and listen to me talk for like a minute, and then if you feel like you're done after a minute, go ahead and turn the video off and start working on what I want you to do. So what we have here are the 7 concepts. 7 concepts are really 7 different lenses through which we start to ask questions about what we're reading, or really anything, what we're listening to. Any of this, like everything I'm saying, you could apply to like rap music or art. These are just different perspectives on making meaning and the meaning that you choose to make, the way that you read certain texts. It's going to be really big for your HL essay, which is in the future, far in the future. But a good way to start an HL essay is to start with some questions around one of these 7 concepts that comes from your reading of one of the texts. You'll notice that representation is the biggest, and I'll just talk about that for a second. Representation, one thing that when we read literature we think of is literature. Characters in literature are very representative. That is, if there is a young African-American character in a book, or a young Caucasian character, or an old woman or an old man, it is very common in your interpretation of that literature to say to yourself, well, I wonder if the writer is trying to say something larger about this group of people. In other words, is this character really supposed to represent a larger group of people, like all old people, or all African-American teenagers, or everyone who's struggling with identity as they go through adolescence, things like that. So now is when what I want you to do is to do another reading, your choice. You can read wherever you want, but I want you to look for sentences or certain moments in the text and actually quote the text for each one of these categories. And if you're not sure for a different category, you can continue to listen. But what I want you to put here is a quote, and you can truncate. Truncate is a word that you should know. It means, if a quote is 85 words, you might just take 7 that really get to the heart of the point you're trying to make, or the relationship you see between that particular quote and identity. So don't worry about it if it's a long quote. Just take a few words, and maybe you'll have a couple from every text, or maybe just one, or maybe some spaces will be blank because you didn't get that far. That's okay. This is something that we'll add to over time. I'm very interested to see what you do choose to put here, but that is that. So I'm now going to start talking about each one of these, and if you want to skip to one, you certainly can. I'll kind of keep my finger pointed in that direction as I talk about it. Who knows how long I'm going to talk? We'll see. Okay, so identity. Identity. When reading texts, students will encounter and interact with a multiplicity of perspectives, voices, and characters. It is usual when reading and interpreting a text to assume that the views are to some extent representative of the writer's identity. However, the relationship between an author and the different perspectives and voices they assume when they write is frequently complex, and this makes the concept of identity an elusive one. The figure that emerges from the reading of various texts by the same author adds to the complexity of the discussion. Conversely, the ways in which the identity of a reader comes into play at the moment of reading a text are equally central to the analysis of the act of reading and interpretation. So, we could take a writer like David Foster Wallace. When David Foster Wallace writes a lot of his essays, he uses a first-person pronoun. He's telling a story from his perspective and relaying his experiences. So is the I in a essay like Shipping Out, is that him? Is that the author? Or is that really like a persona that he created? This is this is also prevalent in Shakespeare. If you ever read Shakespeare's sonnets, when we discuss Shakespeare's sonnets, it's natural to say, oh, in Sonnet 451, Shakespeare argues that, or Shakespeare focuses on, but really it's the poet. We call it the poet speaker when we're talking about Shakespeare, because while he did use autobiographical insights in his poetry, he really created a persona. The same thing is true big time with rap music. In rap music, the artist, Kendrick Lamar or anybody that you like, XXXTentacion, creates an identity, and that identity might play on cultural stereotypes in very deep ways, or tell stories from a first-person perspective that really sound like trouble. This happens not just in Johnny Cash, the great country singer from Arkansas, did the same thing, where he would tell a story from a perspective of a murderer. Well, is Johnny Cash a murderer? No, he's creating a persona to take on the identity of a murderer to explore and entertain concepts. So that's identity. Identity is also your identity. So as a reader, you have a certain perspective that you're coming from. You're drawing on your own understanding of a life as you read, and reading certain pieces of literature you can incorporate that into your identity over time. Then there's also the complexities of identities within characters, and what are the events and realities that shaped this particular character's identity. So identity is wonderfully complex, and we investigate it in the study of literature. Culture. The concept of culture is central to the study of language and literature. It raises the question of how a text relates to the context of its production and reception. So from where was a writer writing? Was a writer writing from a place where they were a university professor and everybody respected all their words? Or was the writer writing from a place where they were really outside of the hierarchy of power in their culture, and they were trying to maybe fight to communicate their perspective? Or throughout the career of the writer, did that change? Maybe they started outside but then became mainstream and wrote from the inside. The concept also plays an important role with regard to the relationship that is established between an individual text and the writing tradition preceding it. This is really important, and it goes all the way to the very, very beginning. I've spoken before about what an influence Ovid was on both Shakespeare and Milton. A tremendous influence, even though Ovid wrote in Latin, both Shakespeare and Milton read in Latin, as all educated people did in Britain in the 16th and 17th centuries. So you have to take that into account when you're interpreting the works. Some people would read Milton and be like, oh my, what is he doing? He has all these references to obscure pieces of Latin poetry, or these obscure religious references that nobody really knows what they mean. He trying to be confusing? Am I not smart enough to understand this? No, it's the culture which produced the work. He produced that for an audience that probably was quite fluent in Latin. Most of the people who read his poetry were. And so you have to take that into account in your interpretation of what the work means. The application of this concept to the study of a text should prompt reflection on the extent to which it is the product of a particular cultural and literary context and how it interacts with it. Creativity. Creativity plays an important part in the experience of reading and writing. The concept is fundamental to analyze and understand the act of writing and the role that imagination plays. When applied to the act of reading, creativity highlights the importance of the reader being able to engage in an imaginative interaction with the text, which generates a range of potential meanings from it above and beyond established interpretations. So the word that we use is the co-construction of meaning. You actually co-construct meaning in an alliance with the author, in that you have suspended your disbelief. You are aware of the conventions of the genre. So if you read a science fiction novel and you go, outer space, well, that's such a dumb, what a dumb book. Well, no, actually, you're kind of dumb because the conventions of the genre presuppose that you're willing to read a story about outer space in order to creatively co-construct meaning with the author who has utilized conventions, such as spaceship, time travel, whatever it is. to create something that's meaningful, that does have meaning for us right now. Communication. The concept of communication revolves around the question of the relationship that is established between a writer and a reader by a means of text. This is kind of like creativity, like this relationship. You're the reader, the writer is the writer. The extent to which writers facilitate communication through their choices of style and structure may be an aspect to analyze in this exploration. So style and structure, what's the kind of language that's used to communicate, and is it clear? Is it abstract? Is it symbolic? Does it have ambiguity built into it? Does it have elements that are unclear? That's what ambiguity means. Maybe the author offers the possibility of several different interpretations, and it's really up to the reader to determine which of these plausible interpretations is the one that they choose. So that's that co-construction of meaning. The writer may also have a particular audience in mind, which may mean assumptions have been made about the reader's knowledge and views. David Foster Wallace wrote for an educated audience, quite educated. John Milton wrote for an audience of his day. Wisława Szymborska, she wrote for a very small audience, and she knew it. She was very honest about the number of people who actually read poetry and who would actually read hers. She said, out of 10,000 people, or I don't know, 10,000 or 1,000, but out of 1,000 people, maybe 1 or 2 will read a poem. Maybe 1 or 2 out of 1,000 would care what a poet thinks about anything. So, in knowing that her audience was so small, she wasn't trying for mass appeal. She wasn't trying to be famous, although she did become quite famous. She was trying to do something that was very personal to her. So that's the kind of communication that she was doing. David Foster Wallace, the essays that you're reading that were published in magazines were edited by editors who wanted to give his essays as much appeal as possible. All of the essays that you're reading that were published in magazines exist in a different version. And those are published in books. And we might talk about that some more if you're very, very interested in David Foster Wallace. Comparing the two is very interesting. Isn't this a fun video to watch? I do so many fun things with my finger. I'm going to move on to perspective. A text may offer a multiplicity of perspectives, which they bring to their interaction with the text. This variety of perspectives impacts on the interpretation of a text, and therefore deserves critical attention and discussion. A text may offer a multiplicity of perspectives. So you may, if you read a novel or a play and race is an issue, there may be characters who are speaking from a racist perspective. There may be characters who are speaking from a non-racist. There may be characters who are sympathetic. Sympathetic means you're supposed to like them, but they might still have some ideas, maybe because of the time that they lived. I'm thinking of a novel that we may read called Their Eyes Were Watching God. And in Their Eyes Were Watching God, it's set shortly after the end of slavery here in the United States. And so some of the African-American characters, many of them have internalized racist understandings of their own value. So does that mean that those characters are racist? Well, if we look at them from the perspective of 2020, yeah, they hold some racist views. If we looked at them from the perspective of the time in which they lived, they really fit into the world of ideas and values that was available to them at the time. Perspective. The fact that the acts of reading and writing happen in a given time and place poses the additional question of how far the context of production and reception have influenced or even shaped those perspectives. Transformation. The study of the connections among texts constitutes the focus of one of the 3 areas of exploration, namely intertextuality, connecting texts. Intertextuality is something that we will talk about. Intertextuality is the ways in which texts are connected. I see it as a little bit distinct from transformation. I'm reading to you from the official IB description of these terms. I see intertextuality as it's relationships between texts, but relationships between texts can be like, there's relationships between words within the same language, because the meaning of words is always defined by the context in which they are spoken. And so if you're into this type of stuff of study of like language and linguistics, we can go pretty deep, because it's one of my areas of interest, like of my own, like, I'm very interested in the way that that language is constructed and what we can do with language and how it is limited in certain ways and unlimited in other ways. It's very interesting to me. Transformation, the complex ways in which texts refer to one another, appropriate elements from one another, and transform them to suit a different aesthetic or communicative purpose. So notice the language I'm using. This is like the language of IB. This is a very sophisticated, not my language so much, but the language that I'm reading. And that's why when it comes to the English exam, 1.5% of people who take the exam get a 7. No one from our high school has ever gotten a 7. There was 1.6 last year. Maybe you'll be the class. I think maybe you will be the class where someone gets a 7. Not that that's the ultimate arbiter of value, but it is a very fair and balanced assessment. So if you get a 7, you earned it. Additionally, the act of reading is potentially transformative in itself, both for the text and the reader. That's good. I'm going for transformation. Some transformations happen through textual interactions that you've already had. I have seen writers in your class say things like, the first time I read This Is Water by David Foster Wallace, I didn't get into it. It didn't make a lot of sense to me. But then I listened to someone speak about what it meant to them, and it piqued my interest. And so I re-engaged with the text, and I found that, in fact, it really was valuable. And in fact, it was quite profoundly valuable. That is transformation. You had a transformation as a reader. And the best thing is, I didn't do anything. You did that through your own interactions with the text. That's very important to me, is that you have your own authentic interactions with text. You will hear what I think about these texts, and you have already, but the questions that you ask and the interactions that you have are much more important than anything that I could say about any of these texts. Representation. And this one's a big one. The way in which language and literature relate to reality has been the subject of much debate among linguists and literary theorists across time. Statements and manifestos by writers have made claims about this relationship, which range from affirming that literature should represent reality as accurately as possible, to claiming that art's absolute detachment and freedom from reality and any duty to represent it in the work of art. Okay, so this has to do with abstract, concrete representations. Think about the difference between Leonardo da Vinci and Salvador Dali and Pablo Picasso. How do they represent reality? And fiction works the same way. In fact, the poetry of Octavio Paz is quite abstract, quite much more like Picasso than like Da Vinci. John Milton's writing is very much like Da Vinci, and that is very formally constructed. And the writers vary. One of the things that I want you to gain a great amount of confidence in is describing the style, the writing style that's been adopted by different writers. And that's one of the key aspects, is their level of abstraction and their level of, concrete, how much obscurity they use, some writings are dense, are like particularly dense and difficult to make meaning from on purpose. And these are all very good. So whatever is done has been done on purpose. And then there's how characters represent the things I've talked about before. So that's 20 minutes. Maybe nobody listened, but maybe you listened to some of it and you found it useful, which is what it's all about.